Right, so as if Israel were not continuing to commit the most heinous atrocities in Gaza and on other fronts besides now. It's war not just with Palestinians in the besieged Strip and West Bank now, but notably also in Lebanon, Yemen, and the world still awaits a possible response directly from Iran in light of the recent assassination carried out allegedly by Israel in their capital of Tehran. But for the last couple of weeks now, schools in Gaza have been repeatedly and specifically targeted. The latest happening in the early hours of this morning in Gaza City, all the way back in the north of Gaza where the Israeli genocide in Gaza basically began, has now been targeted in an airstrike, despite the fact it was known that it was being used as shelter by displaced refugees. Israel seem to have reached a point now where they'll say anything to excuse anything, and they appear to have decided to mark schools as legitimate targets for whatever reason. This latest school is a Hamas command centre to justify striking it. All of this happens to come on the same day that the US have just signed off on another $3.5 billion worth in weapons sales to Netanyahu's barbaric and amoral regime, and of course comes in the wake of Keir Starmer deciding not to stop arms sales to Israel after all. A year turn on what we thought genuinely was coming from him. The lobbyists apparently in control there too. Frankly, where Netanyahu should be fretting about imminent arrest, right now he probably couldn't be happier. Right, so where here in the UK the news cycle has been dominated by riots, it's provided a useful distraction from the ongoing atrocities being committed in the Middle East, with Israel very much still warring away, its war expanding to take in more countries, the risk of things escalating further still very much there. We can't forget it's happening. We have to keep talking about it. If it gets forgotten about, it gets dropped, Israel wins. But in a reminder that all of the most recent tensions have been driven by Israel's genocide in Gaza, overnight they've committed one of their most depraved attacks to date, the latest in a series of depraved attacks, targeting a school that was knowingly being used as shelter for refugees still trapped in the north of the Strip in Gaza City. Over 100 people have been killed in one fell swoop, with dozens more injured, nothing short of a massacre, frankly, at the al-tabin school, where the attack was timed to coincide with the people within performing their morning prayers, and therefore it should come as no surprise to discover most of the victims were women, children and the elderly. Now Israel claimed this was an attack on a Hamas command centre, legitimate target, that it was a hideout for Hamas commanders, that there were 20 Hamas fighters there, they counted apparently. Yet as always seems to be the case, no evidence has been provided for any of it, but that didn't stop them from apparently dropping 3 of their 2,000-pound dumb bombs on the place. This is just the latest in what has been a systematic targeting of schools by Israel in northern Gaza throughout this month. On the 1st of August, they struck the Dalal al-Maghrabi school, killing 15 and injuring 29. On the 3rd, they struck the Hamama and Al-Huda schools, killing 16 and injuring 60. On the 4th, they struck the Nasser and Hassan Salameh schools, killing 30 and injuring 19. On the 8th, they struck the Abdul Fattah al-Muda and al-Zahra schools, killing 17, injuring dozens more, and with 16 people still unaccounted for. And now this latest strike, with the worst casualty rate yet, and still no evidence provided by Israel that Hamas are using schools for anything. Fire rapidly took hold in this latest instance. Rescue teams tried to get to people trapped, but Israel had cut the water off, so there was no way to douse the flames. What of the global response then? Condemnation, of course, demands to see evidence. Well, that won't happen. It never does it? But nor do any meaningful actions come to force Israel to back off and end this. The West just keeps allowing these things to proliferate and carry on, and the response as things stand is that countries like Qatar, the US and the UK are urging Israel and Hamas to enter into the next round of ceasefire talks on the 15th of August in a bid to end the atrocity. Here we go again. After 10 months of genocide, after some 8 months of failed ceasefire talks, how thick have some of these people in these countries got to be, in my view, to realise it isn't going to happen? Every single time talks get close to a resolution, Netanyahu will do something to blow it up. His own people have pointed the finger of blame directly at him as the reason peace cannot come about, why talks each and every time end up failing. He either changes the remit of the negotiators or ends up committing another atrocity somewhere which scuppers everything and causes talks to collapse. Every single time this has happened. There can be no peace, which results in Netanyahu remaining Prime Minister. He knows peace is the end of his tenure. If he agrees to a peace deal, his coalition will collapse, such is the state of the far-right head cases he's gone into government with, keeping him in post. He carries on the war, he stays in place, but Israel's economy teeters on the brink of collapse too. Well, that doesn't matter as long as he's still Prime Minister. Business dealings fall by the wayside, but that doesn't matter as long as he's still Prime Minister. Investors pull out, well, he's still Prime Minister, so that's okay. Israeli people shift their cash out of the country so they don't get taken down with their own nation. And Netanyahu doesn't bat an eyelid. And yet the US have, on the same day as this most recent school strike, handed Israel another $3.5 billion of US public money for Israel to buy more US weapons with. Nothing quite sums the US up quite like urging peace whilst handing over billions in more weapons that they damn well know will be used on more innocent people. More than 40,000 people have now been killed in Gaza, over half of them children, along with over 92,000 wounded. And still the weapon sales continue. Sure, Biden is going to shortly go, come what may, the end of Genocide Joe, whatever the result in the US elections. But Kamala Harris won't commit to an arms embargo should she succeed in. She's been asked, she's not come forward with an answer on that, and that should speak volumes in and of itself. The EU have indulged in hand-wringing as well whilst they've been supporting Israel. Joseph Borrell, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, has taken to Twitter to profess his horror over these school strikes. Horrified by images from a sheltering school in Gaza hit by an Israeli strike with reportedly dozens of Palestinian victims. At least 10 schools were targeted in the last weeks. There's no justification for these massacres. We are dismayed by the terrible overall death toll. Over 40,000 Palestinians have been killed since the beginning of the war. We regret and condemn Minister Smotrich's opposition against the interest of the Israeli people to a deal. A ceasefire is the only way to stop the killing of civilians and secure the hostages' release. The buck stops with Netanyahu, Mr. Borrell. Sure, Bezalel Smotrich is a hard-right maniac who absolutely does not want peace. But Netanyahu should never have brought such fanatics into government. And it is Netanyahu who is Prime Minister. It is Netanyahu who is documented as having interfered and scuppered peace talks repeatedly to this day. So please do feel free to point the finger of blame at him as well. Here in the UK, it was looking like, despite everyone's concerns about ardent Zionist Keir Starmer taking power, it looked like he was not going to ignore international law. He was not going to ignore his own legal advice. There was much discussion about ending arms sales to Israel, and then all of a sudden it got U-turned on. Why was that then? The Israel lobby is why. They heavily finance Starmer and his party. Many of his MPs have taken donations from pro-Israel sources. Labour Friends of Israel, which frankly should be proscribed instead, has much influence still. The Jewish Labour movement is filled with pro-Zionists, and some of their representatives are now Labour MPs. The Starmer regime has this week been praising the CST, the Community Security Trust, a charity supposedly there to defend the rights of Jewish people to live safely and securely, yet do so in part at least by conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Starmer's latest comments concerning his praise of the CST, no mention of these ongoing attacks on Gaza schools specifically at all though. He's not spoken on them once. Foreign Secretary David Lammy has, just as I was writing this bit, issued a comment, but with all the same usual platitudes. We're all frankly sick and tired of hearing at this point. Appalled by the Israeli military strike on al-Tabin school and the tragic loss of life, Hamas must stop endangering civilians. Israel must comply with international humanitarian law. We need an immediate ceasefire to protect civilians, free all hostages, and end restrictions on aid. Stop selling arms to Israel then, and stop shaking their bloody hands when they are also so blood-drenched. Also, where were your words of condemnation when all those other schools this month were hit? Or was this latest strike prominent enough to require a response on this occasion? Not only are we still arming the regime, we've apparently now reopened trade talks with Israel, the 5th round of a free trade agreement. So even Brexit is now pushing us into closer economic ties with a regime committing genocide, no less. Because our leaders, this Starmer-led government, is no more moral than the last lot on such matters. Netanyahu is given no incentive to actually stop. He is never put under enough pressure to force his hand. He is allowed to ruin peace talks. He is getting away with ongoing genocide because he is still being armed. He is still enjoying close diplomatic ties with Western governments. He will enjoy their protection from those on a war footing with Israel. He enjoys the protection of the UN at the UN of the United States veto. Where the hell is the pressure on him to actually stop and actually change? No wonder he can now be as brazen as to strike schools, say what he likes about them and present no evidence about it, because he's never going to come under pressure to be asked for any. The trade talks here have to stop. The arms sales must stop. Diplomatic support and protection must stop. All must be stopped, contingent upon a peaceful resolution to the end of this conflict. Because right now our leaders are sitting on their hands in loyal deference, whilst warring violence and escalation just spreads like a plague outwards, taking in more nations who perversely then get warned off getting involved. Well, somebody has to, and if you won't push for peace, then more war unfortunately becomes the only obvious outcome. There's enough historical precedent for us all to know that. Israel are now destroying schools and everyone inside them because that's how little pressure they are actually under internationally to stop, and it's not good enough. Netanyahu is now so brazen he thinks he can get away with assassinating Hamas leaders on foreign soil. Iran's at that, in their own capital, and he'd be right given Western political responses warning Iran not to retaliate. Well, they probably will. They're not the sort not to. They haven't yet. But get all the details on that story and the ramifications of it in this video recommendation here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.